Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our panel Resistance, Reformation, and Rehabilitating Cultural Identity in the Caribbean. I'm joined by three Howard PhD students. Well, I'm one of them, but Lisa Latouche, Emily Duru, which is me, and Anjan Basu. And we have a very exciting panel for you today. We are looking at how the Caribbean has become a powerful testament to resistance and resilience, and we are hoping to explore how crucial elements of resistance, reformation, and rehabilitation shape cultural identity within the Caribbean context. And we're doing so by highlighting its dynamic and constantly negotiated nature. We are drawing on the creative works of Caribbean theorists and authors, including Stuart Hall, Sylvia Wynter, Erna Broadbent, and Maurice Condé, among others. So these forces include the indigenous struggle, the repercussions of Western ideations of whiteness, and the complex legacies of post slavery societies. And by examining these themes, this panel hopes to illuminate how cultural identities in the Caribbean are dynamic entities that are continually formed, negotiated, and even redefined. Our first panelist, Lisa Latouche, examines indigeneity in the work Kalinago Blood by Alec Lazar. In the novel, Lazar features across time and space, tracing waterways and rhizomes to the dawn of Caribbean colonialism to recuperate Kalinago voices. She examines Lazar's use of indigenization as a way of interrogating revolutionary periods of resistance, resilience, and reclamation that continue, as I said, to shape cultural identity. My presentation continues the conversation on resistance and reclamation by examining how the authors Ella Broadbent and Grace Nichols employ metaphor and symbolism to challenge and subvert imposed limitations on the African Caribbean woman's body. Lastly, our panel's final presenter, Anjan Basu, looks at Erna Broadbert's Mayal and Maurice Condé's I, Tituba, to reveal the lasting effects of American whiteness and its extent beyond the geopolitical borders of the United States of America. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to talking with you more about our panel presentations.
Hello, my name is Lisa Latouche Jones. I am a PhD student in the English department at Howard University in Washington, D.C. I am presenting on Kalinago Blood, Revolution, Resistance, Resilience, and Reclamation. Presentation overview. Who is Ali Lazar? Kalinago Blood, a brief historical overview. The thesis statement and theoretical framework. I'm looking at cultural identity in the novel and a brief allegorical analysis on Kalinago Blood. So, who is Alec Lazar? Alec Lazar was born in Dominica in October of 1934. He is the author of numerous short stories and four amazing books, including Farcelle and Kalinago Blood. He worked as a civil servant, more specifically in finance management. His writings are self consciously theoretical, and he contributes to the ongoing conversation of indigenous consciousness and cultural identity. Kalinago Blood is a work of historical fiction set in the 1600s. The narrative revolves a real English family, Captain Thomas and his family, who he later became the governor of St. Kitts. The novel critically examines the early stages of colonialism in the Caribbean and the Europeans' deliberate attempt to exterminate the indigenous people. It provides a critical examination of the Kalinago's struggle to preserve their political freedom and to maintain control of their territories against slavery, racism, and what Hilary Beckles describes as, quote, the full economic force of Atlantic capitalism, close quote. The book offers a clear glimpse into the culture of the Kalinagos and their firm stance concerning their resistance to the commodification of their labor. Central to Kalinago Blood is the narrator of the story, whose name is Barbie, and she is Thomas Warner's mistress and maid, and she is an indigenous person. This is what the book looks like. I encourage you to go out and buy it and read it. It's an amazing work. My thesis statement, leaning on Stuart Hall's interpretation of cultural identity, this paper examines how Lazar employs allegories to recuperate Caribbean indigenous sensibilities through the use of indigenization as a way of interrogating revolutionary periods of resistance, resilience, and reclamation that continue to shape cultural identity. So I will be using Stuart Hall's Cultural Identity and Diaspora. In his essay Cultural Identity and Diaspora, Stuart Hall defines identity as the names we give to the different ways we are positioned by and position ourselves within. He describes identity as a production which is never complete. In other words, identity is always changing as it is impacted by numerous factors. Regarding cultural identity, Hall offers two different ways to look at it in the Caribbean context. One is through the lens of one shared culture and shared ancestry, where cultural identities reflect common historical experiences and shared cultural codes. That is to say, the fundamental oneness beneath the surface level differences. And Hall offers a second frame with which to consider cultural identity. He breaks down this second framing into the African presence, the European presence, and the New World presence. It is this perspective he focuses on in the essay, and it looks at the differences of what constitute Caribbean people. Hall says that, quote, it is only from this second position that one can properly understand the traumatic event of the colonial experience, close quote. So, now we're moving on to cultural identity in Kalinago blood. Laza explores the notion of the one shared culture by capturing the collective colonial experiences that Caribbean people have in common. So Laza explores this oneness through a macro regional exploration. He provides a multiplicity of settings through breathtaking landscapes and waterways from Trinidad to St. Kitts and the islands in between, including Dominica and Antigua. And I would say that these islands and features exist today as they did then in the 1600s, even with the onset of climate change. So, place is a shared culture. Laza also shows this one shared culture through the interconnectedness of the indigenous people among the islands and the witnessing of the arrival of the Europeans and Africans. He really demonstrates the acculturation and the syncretism of and their collective experiences, which changes are irreversible. This is a beautiful image of my island, Dominica, which is featured heavily in Kalinago Blood, and this photo is by Yuri A. Jones. Moving on, cultural identity in Kalinago Blood. So this second framing looks at the differences, which is the African presence, as we said, the European presence, and the New World presence. In the second framing, the presence that Hall discusses is the African presence, which he describes as a site of the repressed and which remains as a presence in Caribbean culture. Kalinago blood certainly highlights the beginning of this culture, and the African presence is already repressed, although it is at the early stages of the process. The enslaved Africans in Kalinago blood experienced, quote, the constant cracking of the whip, end quote, the, quote, living in the squalor of their huts, eating monotonous fare that was their daily diet, end quote. They also experienced restrictions which were placed on their movements, and they were forbidden to speak their own language. On the other hand, their Africanness remains a part of them in several ways. On the plantation during food scarcity, quote, the women showed remarkable ingenuity in finding supplies for fresh food, mostly wild yam, while the men trapped birds and hunted agouti or other wild game. End quote. So in Kalinago blood, the Africans they practice subsistence farming. They dance, they sing, they tell stories, they retain their names such as Obonyo and Kawa and Ife, even if they are given European names. So Kalinago blood really examines the resistance of the African, the insistence on remembrance and reclamation. So African cuisine, dances, oral storytelling have all been passed down and are still present today. All right, so this is two men stick fighting. Now, while we're on the African presence in Kalinago blood, um, the early on, the enslaved Africans in the story acknowledged the difficulty or impossibility of returning to Africa. For instance, after Indian Warner, who is ostracized from his father's mansion, is speaking with Obonio, an enslaved African, about running away, he says, "Why don't you run?" And Obonio says sadly, "We are far away from home. Where can we run to? Wherever we go, there is always the sea between us and our homeland. This island is small. There is no place to hide." And Indian says, "Yes, there is." I think in that exchange that the African is comparing the vastness of the African landmass to the smallness of the island. Whereas in Africa there may be landscapes to escape to, he cannot fathom being escaping, and remaining on land on this little island. So the choices that they have therefore are to remain on the plantation, to join the established Kalinago settlements, or to become Maroons. And in this book, Lazard does show some Africans joining the Kalinago settlements where they form families. Important to the discussion about the African presence is Hall's claim that Caribbean people of whatever ethnic background must acknowledge this African presence, and whether it is an origin of our identities, it is an imaginative geography and history, because the original Africa is no longer there. It too has been transformed. So therefore, we cannot literally go home again. And in the story, even if Obonio or the other Africans could find their way home, they would not have found it the same, because they are not the same people who left. Their experiences have changed their perspectives, and home has adapted a new way of functioning. And Hall speaks about this discontinuity, which includes the dragging of Africans from different parts of the African continent into slavery. So this means that the people were cut off from life as they knew it, and they had to create new forms of existence in the different plantation economies that they were sent to. So there's a different concept of home. Hall states further in Home Thoughts from Abroad that identities become multiple and no one can return to what they previously left, because there is always something in between. In other words, the acculturation and indigenization process has already taken root. According to Sylvia Winter in Junkanoo in Jamaica, the label acculturation represents the modification of the indigenous life under influences from the white man's world. She also describes it as different cultures finding contact points at which fusion and transformation of one by the other is achieved. She says that because the early stages of the process also involve the rooting of the African in the New World, the process of indigenization is used. So Winter defines indigenization as as follows. It is this process represents the more secretive process by which the dominated culture survives and resists. In Kalinango blood, some of the African practices were subverted. However, they persisted and still continue to persist. In the African presence in Caribbean literature, Brathwaite agrees with this when he says African culture not only crossed the Atlantic, it crossed, survived, and creatively adapted itself to its new environment. So in the Caribbean, where different groups of people, willingly and unwillingly converged and lost or forgot their roots and their language because of the harsh environments, they unwittingly merged their cultures, their beliefs and customs, which is syncretism, right? In an effort to piece things back together in ways that all who converged could participate in. So this includes the syncretism of religions, the adoption of different diets, and the creation of Creole languages and art, among other things. As Stuart Hall says, they were recomposed, reframed, put together in a new way. Now we're moving on to the European presence in Kalinago blood. The second presence that Hall examines in his essay, Cultural Identity and Diaspora, is the European presence, which is the dominant power. And it is about disruption, exclusion, violence, hostility, and aggression. He describes the European presence as a case which is endlessly speaking, a presence that introduces the question of power and creates a sense of otherness. Kalinago blood is rife with the European presence, as they are the ones who dominate spaces and take over lands. They are the ones with more sophisticated weaponry, controlling negotiations, attacking Kalinago villages in their sleep, and imposing their customs and religions and beliefs upon other groups like the Kalinagos and the Africans. One clear example of this imposition is at the beginning of the novel, where Barbie, who is a teenager at the time, is living among the white settlers in St. Kitts. She's also the lover of the governor, and her nakedness is offensive to the English, particularly to the women. So she is made to quote cover her body with the coarse cloth that was so revolting, and the fresh, clean smell of her body should now be sullied by such unnatural confinement. End quote. So in this situation, Barbie has lost part of her identity of what makes her indigenous because she no longer enjoys the quote, the freedom of limbs unhampered, end quote. And her body is no longer nurtured by the sun and the wind and the rain. The Europeans made her feel othered. Okay, and another example of that otherness and domination is through Indian Warner, who is Barbie's son. After his father becomes ill, he is prevented from seeing his father because he's considered a savage, right? The Reverend and his wife, they think it is their duty to save the governor from his own son. And Indian feels uncomfortable in that situation. And the quote I have there is Indian, quote, did not like the way their eyes followed him. They made him feel as if he was breaking into a part of their lives that was closed to him, end quote. So both Barbie and Indian are scrutinized and judged by the Europeans, and this creates discomfort and, of course, a sense of alienation. The third and final influential entity that Hall discusses is that of the New World or the Americas. It is not so much about power, but according to Hall, it is the places where strangers from every part of the globe collided. The New World presence is certainly identifiable in the novel. Of course, it is set in the Caribbean, on land that did not originally belong to the Europeans or Africans or the peoples who came after. And one example, in the novel that I pulled out is this quote: Barbie saw strange men emerging from the bushes near the shore. Their skin was raw like meat. So the strong presence of the Kalinago people in Kalinago blood offers space to imagine, the new world during that time. Laza demonstrates the cultural values and the way of life of the Kalinago people. right? And one of them is where he shows the vegetable patch, the garden in which the women grow, and also how they bathed naked in the river. So one quote I have here is Indian bathed himself in the river. There were several boys and girls all naked and uninhibited as they tossed each other in the clear pools. End quote. So, as mentioned before, the Caribbean is a place where indigenization occurred, fusing different cultural elements to form a new identity. For example, Babe has a mixed great grandchild with tinted hair and bleached skin carrying the stain of the white blood. So, this shows miscegenation. Over the course of the novel, the Kalinago and other indigenous tribes are overpowered, and although they resist fiercely, they still lose most of their land. So those who survive have lost a big part of their identity, including their way of life and their language. In the very beginning of the novel, Babe says, Our tribe is dying. And at the end of the novel she says, They killed all our sons. No. I'm moving on to my brief allegorical analysis. I read Kalinago Blood as an allegorical and political text. Captain Thomas Warner, who later becomes governor, has three sons, one of whom is half Indian, and that is his child with Bobby. He and his white sons, who eventually play key roles in sustaining the British Empire, symbolize the enduring legacy of plantation ownership and the power of imperialism and colonialism. Warner's actions reflect the strategies of conquest, betrayal, and exploitation that characterized colonial expansion. His preemptive strike on the Kalinago symbolizes the destructive impact of colonial greed and more widespread disregard for the indigenous rights and indigenous life. His colonization of Babe, his lover for over 20 years, mirrors the European practice of providing just enough concessions to maintain control over their colonies or to prevent rebellion. Babe's character represents the indigenous people. Babe, the captive Inegri girl, represents the intersection of cultures and the disruption of indigenous identity. Her experiences reflect the trauma of cultural assimilation, forced hybridity, and the struggle to maintain cultural heritage in the face of colonial dominance. I think the relationship between Warner and Babe is a metaphor for the colonizer and the colonized. Their complex relationship symbolizes, I think, the power imbalance and exploitation inherent in colonialism. It reflects how colonial powers impose themselves upon indigenous cultures, often leading to fractured identities and the subjugation of indigenous women. Now, finally, Indian's character demonstrates the acculturation, miscegenation, and indigenization that occurs. So, the son of Warner and Babe, he represents the emergence of a Creole identity, a blending of indigenous, European, and African heritages. His identity crisis and the tension surrounding his existence symbolizes the struggles of post-colonial societies to reconcile their hybrid cultural roots. And I think Indian's death at his brother's hand represents a betrayal of trust. I would say here that the Kalinago people of Dominica were promised to be left alone and undisturbed, but the English broke that treaty and secured Dominica by the terms of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And I think this is what Indian's character represents. So at the time of Indian Warner's death, he had been the chief of Dominica and influential in the Caribbean. Therefore, his death also symbolizes the Europeans' efforts to erase the Kalinago people. At the end of the novel, Barbie introduces her great grandson, who is a Kalinago, with, as I said, tinted hair and bleached skin. And because, most of her family have already died. And she says, he has the stain of the white blood, which will not be wiped out. I think this signifies the permanent disruptions caused by slavery. And more importantly, the baby signifies that the tribe will live on in whatever altered means. So, thank you so much for listening. Kalinago Blood really offers glimpses of colonial life at the beginning of slavery, and it offers compelling critiques on the spaces that people had to negotiate on varying levels politically, socially, economically, morally, and otherwise. And also, this masterfully crafted allegorical story demonstrates the resilience of humanity and the reclamation of dignity. I think Lazar's work is a testament to the fact that the creative journey persists because the task of witnessing and remembering remains ongoing. This is my works cited page. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Again, my name is Lisa Latouche. I am a PhD student in the English department at Howard University. This is my contact information.
Good day, everyone. My name is Emily Duru, and today I will be presenting my paper titled From Liminality to Liberation, African Caribbean Woman's Transhistorical Journey in Erna Brodber's Mayel and the Selected Poetry of Grace Nichols. So, my presentation delves into this negotiation of liminality and liberation by examining the literary techniques employed by two significant Caribbean women authors. So, Erna Brodber from Jamaica in her novel Mayel, and Grace Nichols, a Guyanese poet, and her poetry collection I Have Crossed an Ocean. Specifically, I ask, how does literature, through transhistorical symbolism and metaphors, empower African Caribbean women authors to transcend the imposed liminality of the Black diaspora and envision spiritual and bodily liberation? The Black female body, as we know, has been a site of intense political contention and since before the Middle Passage, even. So colonialism's dehumanization, particularly through plantation slavery, which brought on forced labor, rape, and forced maternity for African women. Um, this kind of initiated a systemic stripping of our bodily autonomy, of Black women's bodily autonomy, and it kind of extended into a psychic hijacking, to borrow a term from my professor, Dr. Hannah Regis. This psychic hijacking was perpetuated by colonial knowledge systems that devalued African epistemologies. So this deliberate dissemination of imperialist ideology created an imposed state of liminality for African Caribbean women across the diaspora. Brodber and Nichols directly address this by utilizing the psychic journeys of the protagonist, employing symbolism and metaphor to explore suppressed spiritual networks. Their works acknowledge the ambivalence in African Caribbean ancestral histories and traditions, expelling pervasive imperialist and even zombifying forces from female characters' bodies and minds. Ultimately, their literature allows for the reformulation of Caribbean women's bodies as sites of ascension from socially imposed liminality. And this is achieved through the reclamation of African matrilineal ancestry and spirituality. To fully interrogate the hybridity ancestral ties of African Caribbean cultures, I think it's crucial to first understand that colonialism didn't erase history as much as an African history, I should really clarify, as much as it devalued it. So Erna Brodber's Mayel exemplifies this by using Mayelism, which is a spiritual practice rooted in West African and ancient Egyptian traditions, to rewrite what Edouard Glissant would term as history with a capital H, right? So what Glissant is talking about is a history marked by colonialism's attempt to dislocate Caribbean and African heritage. So Grace Nichols' poetry similarly speaks to this dislocation and devaluation, I feel, as in I Is a Long Memory Woman, poems like Night is Her Robe and Omen depict a speaker's journey from enslavement to a reconnection with African spiritual practices, allowing her to resist the colonial gaze and reclaim matrilineal knowledge. Later collections, such as The Fat Black Woman, with poems like My Black Triangle and Configurations, symbolically link the speaker's reclaimed sexuality to her body's position within the Atlantic slave trade, and the slave trade routes in the history of colonization. And this is highlighting how identity making remains problematized in diaspora long after abolition, right? Mayel itself, the book, is a haunting exploration of spirit thievery, right? So, what, as I think Puri puts it, which is colonialism, and also explores colonialism and the power of community in rural Jamaica. So the novel centers on Ella, who returns home to Grovetown, Jamaica, and she's afflicted with a pseudocyesis pregnancy after a failed marriage. And Western medicine fails her, leading the community to turn to Mialism for healing. And as the narrative unfolds, the enduring legacy of colonialism within Western institutions is revealed. The anti colonial stance in this context becomes a radical reclamation of individuality and alternative modes of healing, community, and spirituality. The Mayel practitioners' underground networks in Grovetown combat the zombification of Ella and the wider community and serve as oppositional knowledge systems to the colonial project. By reconnecting characters to their mind, body, and spirit, Broadbur powerfully advocates for Caribbean women authors to tell the half that has never been told. Quote. As that is coming from the book itself. So these literary efforts align with Sylvia Wynter's, and as we'll explore it in the theoretical frameworks, I feel like as I've explored with these two texts that I'm looking at, these literary efforts align with Sylvia Wynter's theory of the third event, which posits that humans' unique ability to create and tell stories shapes our understanding of reality and challenges and can challenge the Eurocentric historical narratives of Event One, what she calls Event One, which is the creation of the world, and what she calls Event Two, which is the creation of the white man. So Broadber's use of ancestral knowledge systems and African spirituality, as well as Nichols' use of this idea of remembering their matrilineal heritage, um, in it directly challenges and reimagines colonial narratives and aligns with what I see as Winter's third event, which is demonstrating the power of storytelling as resistance. So my analysis employs a comparative literary approach to select the works by Erna Broadber and Grace Nichols. And this study is informed by a post-colonial feminist lens and draws specifically from the critical theories of Homi K. Bhabha, Sylvia Wynter, and Melvin Rahman. So this post-colonial framework allows for an examination of how these authors challenge colonial power structures and subvert dominant narratives. The central focus on female protagonists facilitates an exploration of gendered power dynamics and experiences of marginalized women. Homi Bhabha's concept of the third space and Sylvia Wynter's third event are crucial for understanding the hybrid identities and alternative knowledge systems presented by the authors. Bhabha's work on mimicry and ambivalence, which talks about where colonial mimicry desires what he says, quote, almost the same but not quite, and other, which helps to understand how Ella in Grovetown became zombified when you are this almost the same but not quite mentally hijacked colonial subject. And then when put into conversation with Winter's third event, as discussed, it positions Africa as a site of cultural production, countering the colonial narrative of the cursed and barbaric, what she calls the cursed and barbaric land that we are often thought to think of Africa as. Melvin Raming's critical theory of spirit provides a framework for examining the spiritual dimensions within these texts. Raming argues that Maoism, Obeah, and other African spiritual practices offer a path to understanding coherence and resistance through imperial institutions. He describes Mael as presupposing Mael as in the spiritual practice, as presupposing what quote the existence of timeless and all pervasive presence that operates on individual, communal, and cross cultural levels to release human beings from the spiritual paralysis of essentialist and materialist ideologies. End quote. A close reading of the novel and selected poems focuses on narrative structure, character development, symbolism, and diction. By comparing and contrasting Broadber and Nichols' approaches, this study identifies similarities and differences in their engagement with themes of identity, power, and resistance. The key themes analyzed are hybridity, spirituality, and female agency. This research aims to deepen our understanding of how African Caribbean women writers challenge colonial discourse and empower marginalized voices, ultimately contributing to a liberatory literary tradition, which I hope to explore. So first, we're going to start with an analysis of Mayel. In Erna Broadber's Mayel, spiritual theft and soul draining serve as central recurring symbolic metaphors for how colonization strips subjects of their connection to native epistemologies. We're introduced to Maydeen, who accuses her husband, Reverend William Brassington, a Methodist minister, of spirit thievery. Reverend Brassington's ministry, which aims to emulate European ideals, is a draining force that seeks to, quote, exercise and replace. Maydeen recognizes the ambivalence of his doctrine, aligning with Baba's concept of the colonial subject being caught between the idealized colonial narratives and then the actual lived realities and the incongruence that lies there. So this mimicry renders the Caribbean subject a ghost, unable to attain a quote, a ghost unable to retain the reality it seeks. And this is really interesting. I love this concept because I think in this text, the biggest thing is liminality. Like, is what I'm arguing is liminality, right? So being in this in between space where you have a lived reality, and then versus what the colonial narratives are, putting forth. That is what creates this liminal space of being in between in passage, right? So this novel explicitly critiques colonial education, portraying it as a cultural theft that co-opts students into mimicking the empire. Ella, a central character, embodies this mimicry early on by reciting Kipling, symbolizing her spirit's theft long before her marriage. Her pseudocyesis pregnancy, a parasite, which is like a parasitic pseudo pregnancy, essentially, is the physical manifestation of her depleted state, a result of a lifelong colonial project to sever her mind body connection. Theorist Shalini Puri notes that before her marriage, Ella devalued her hybridity due to her environment. Therefore, her recovery necessitates rejecting this mimicry and redefining her own culture, spirituality, and identity. This expulsion of the alabaster baby symbolizes the expulsion of colonial paradigms that she embodied. Puri writes this when she says, quote, breaking of the writes that what is ha- Puri writes that what is happening is, quote, a breaking of the gauze-like membrane that figures a connection of the mind and body, the breaking of the mental barrier that separates the English people from the Grovetown people. The colonist text from her life experience. This reconnection led to Ella's realization of the ambivalence she and others experience due to colonial education. Upon returning to the classroom, Ella challenges the curriculum, recognizing that texts like Animal Farm and Kipling's poetry deceive and mask Caribbean history. She confronts the notion of teaching children to be, quote, zombies who cannot rethink for themselves. End quote. This marks a significant evolution for Ella, demonstrating the power of voice in shaping self-perception. Broadburn, through Ella, directly critiques the imperial education system's demand for colonial mimicry, advocating instead for teaching, quote, the half that has never been told, end quote. Ella's healing is contingent on her embodying her heritage and reconnecting several parts of her spirit. The novel also highlights the subtle nature of spiritual draining that one might unknowingly offer themselves parts of themselves until it is fully depleted. Ella's realization of being drained after Selwyn's Coon show leads to an internal struggle and a multiplicity of self. Um, to borrow a term from Baba. This plurality of consciousness, as Raming notes, expands. Or I messed up. I messed up bad. We're redoing that part. The novel highlights the subtle nature of spiritual draining. One might unknowingly offer parts of themselves until it's completely depleted. Ella's realization of being drained after Selwyn's Coon show leads to an internal struggle in what Raman would call a multiplicity of self. This plurality of consciousness, as Raman notes, expands the quote spectrum of human consciousness, allowing Broadbent to envision a point of origin outside the Western ideations of human beings, aka the third event. The novel opens with Ma Cyrus practicing nihilism on Ella, creating, quote, a reconnection of Ella to spirits she has not been with in a long time, end quote. This non-linear connection to spirits and ancestors is crucial for expelling the effects of colonization and also for Ella's psychic overhaul and the ascension from her depressed state. The narrative's clinical structure, beginning and ending with the expulsion of Ella's pseudocyesis, symbolizes the breaking of the barrier between the spiritual and physical worlds, resisting Western notions of time and the separation of life and myth. Nihilism, as portrayed, embodies both to create a philosophy of self that extends beyond the Caribbean back to the mother continent of Africa. While Mael explicitly details Ella's transformation, Grace Nichols' I Have Crossed an Ocean relies on trans-historical metaphors to elevate the poem's speakers and reconnect them to Afro-spiritual practices. In Night, in the poem Night is Her Robe, Nichols uses imagery of twilight and deliberate movement to depict the enslaved woman's journey into root work, symbolizing the necessary concealment of these powerful, African grounded practices from the colonial gaze. The juxtaposition of the restrictive sugarcane plantation with the island's darkened edges highlights the space for cultivating plants with both harming and healing properties, demonstrating the increased agency for enslaved women. This return to traditional African spirituality also offers a chance for the reconnection with a disconnected African ancestral lineage. Grace Nichols further employs the plurality of consciousness in the poem Omen to reconnect the speaker to her lineage. Recognizing the need for a native spirituality, the speaker calls upon her ancestors, stating, I cannot work with this craft on my own strength. End quote. Similar to Ella's reliance on Mael practitioners for healing, the speaker acknowledges her fruitlessness without connection to her matrilineal bonds. The colloquial spelling signifies a departure from traditional English and an embrace of hybridity. The invocation of Dahomey of quote Dahomey lurking in my shadows, Yoruba lurking in my shadows, Ashanti lurking in my shadows, end quote, implies the subconscious or spiritual omnipresence of these ancestral cultures, shaping the speaker's identity. This confusion, brought on by the sudden multiplicity of selves, drives her lust for guidance in navigating her hybrid identity. As this collection transitions to the Fat Black Woman's poems, we see an acknowledgement of the speaker's ambivalence. She neither conforms to the restrictive box nor mimics European values. Instead, she reclaims her sexual independence and bodily autonomy, a freedom not afforded to the enslaved, long memoried woman, but available to the free 20th century woman and 21st century woman as well. In the poem Configurations, Nichols subverts typical representations of Black women's sexuality, repositioning the African Caribbean woman's body as a dominating force. The exchange of power is evident as the white man offers material objects, while the Black woman responds with sensual offerings interwoven with her cultural heritage, like her quote cloud burst of parrots and quote Bantu buttocks end quote. The poem oscillates between dominance and submission, alluding to Columbus's role in their sexual encounter. The Black woman ultimately asserts her power by withholding sexual gratification and transforming him into her subject, culminating in the imagery of the golden stool, as she puts it, symbolizing her as an ultimate authority. This poem offers rich symbolism, elevating African ancestry and abstracting colonial history within the context of Black women's sexuality. This marks a shift from the earlier poems where autonomy was gained under concealment, now openly reclaiming identity. Mara Scanlon notes that this interplay between acknowledging historical trauma and sexual positivity exemplifies Nichols' quote, revisionary mythopoesis, end quote, which recenters the female heroine in her own body. The amalgamation of past and present histories within the African Caribbean woman's body as a site of resistance is furthered in the poem My Black Triangle. The extended metaphor of the black triangle simultaneously represents the vulva as a source of creation and pleasure in the triangle trade route. By evoking the Bermuda Triangle, Nichols imbues the Black woman's body with mystery and depth, subverting negative connotations and empowering the speaker. The defiant closing lines, quote, spreading and growing, trusting and flowing, my Black Triangle carries the seal of approval of my deepest self, end quote, emphasizes the liberation from, quote, the dry fears of patriarchy, quote, end quote, and the self acceptance. My Black Triangle is a bold celebration of Black female sexuality, challenging societal norms and asserting agency. Nichols' intertwining of history and metaphorical language creates a narrative that connects the psychological with the storytelling symbolic, disrupting disrupting typical colonial narratives and aligning with Winter's third event. In conclusion, the rigid and agenda driven colonial narratives fail to capture the untold stories of the Caribbean, making it imperative for Caribbean writers to excavate and challenge controlling images. Erna Broadbur, by complicating colonial history, presents a new herstory where the female protagonist can fulfill her emptied psyche, challenging colonial narrative structures that deny the colonial object's subjectivity. Similarly, Grace Nichols' "I" is a long memory woman reconnects fragmented pasts of enslaved African women, enabling them to practice root work and forge new hybrid identities. For both authors, resistance involves crafting a new paradigm rooted in history, folklore, and spirituality that counters imperial conquest and power, instead, fostering communal uplift through reunification with their severed identities. The ultimate display of ascension from the colonial paradigm is powerfully illustrated in the Fat Black Woman's poems, where the speaker embodies the whole of her past, connected to her matrilineage and empowered by her herstory. As evidenced in My Black Triangle and Configurations, a renewed sexual empowerment allows the fat Black woman to flip the script. In both Nichols' poems and Broadbur's novel, the site of ascension remains rooted in African Caribbean women's physicality, suggesting that authors can envision new liberatory realities by simply remembering the body. These Caribbean women writers powerfully demonstrate the reclamation of narratives and the reimagining of identities. By challenging the colonial gaze and embracing their herstories, they offer a vision of an anti-colonial future where the marginalized rewrite their own stories to include the half that has never been told. Thank you so much. These are my references. If you have any questions, please just contact me. You can reach me at my email, my LinkedIn as well. And if you scan this QR code, it'll give you all of my contact. All right. Take care. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Anjan Basu, and this is my presentation. Forgotten Bad Behavior, American History, and the Caribbean Experience. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a PhD student at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Here's a copy of my abstract. Let you read that at your own leisure, and we'll just go ahead and jump into it. So, this is the current president of the United States of America. In November of 2024, President-elect Donald Trump announced his plan to dismantle the Department of Education, leaving educational curricula to the determination of the states. Trump has also stated that education of American children should be patriotic, nationalistic, and unified. Trump has yet to reveal what the new American curriculum will look like exactly. If it follows the current conservative trend of anti-wokeness, then any history taught that America is predicated upon racism will be stricken from the curriculum. At that point, slavery in America could be taught as labor relocation. Teaching the youth of America as a matter of public policy will remove any of the wrongdoings, the immoral, the genocidal impulses and directives from not only American history, but also the American cultural memory. Thus, Americans can stand with a sense of moral superiority when they stand upon their culture of democracy and freedom. The daily tyrannies, the orchestrated community lynchings, the use of the national military on its own citizens, casually forgotten in the present. And then the present gets to move forward into a tomorrow that is also righteous. The new curriculum doesn't need to teach the youth that slavery never happened. The sanitation of American history and memory only requires that the youth believe that there are no effects of slavery on anyone anymore in this country. So I refuse to call him, such and such Trump. So I'm just going to tell you what Mr. Trump is doing. In order to do so, I would like to highlight this particular book. Nicole Guidotti Hernandez's Unspeakable Violence, Remapping the U.S. and Mexican National Imaginaries, published in 2011, argues white on Mexican violence in the western United States during the latter half of the 19th century was far more prevalent than conventional wisdom allows, and that violence has been erased from the national memory and collective consciousness of American culture. Thus, American culture can maintain its own perceptions of moral superiority on a global stage. And white supremacy continues to go relatively unchallenged and therefore remains the norm of American culture. This operation not only erases the shame, guilt, and accountability of American white violence for white Americans, but it also mummifies the human suffering. It gags the throats of the dispossessed and marginalized, and subverts thunderous roars of liberation into meek murmurs. With such quiet cries of dissent, the average daily American life can continue in all of its God ordained glory. But even if they just erase the African American voice, there is evidence in the Caribbean black experience as well. Hence my thesis. I vehemently disagree with the sanitation of American history to make American whiteness sound more pleasant, amicable, benevolent, and civilizing, for the proof also rests in the black archives. To demonstrate American white violence against blackness, even in the Caribbean, I examined Maurice Conde's I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem, published in 1992, and Erna Broadber's Mayal, published in 1988. The stories are set some 200 years apart. Tituba, an enslaved person brought to the Massachusetts colonies in the 1690s, experiences American white violence in a similar manner to Ella O'Grady Leary in the early 1900s. Tituba was from Barbados, Ella was from Jamaica. Both protagonists go from a Caribbean context, meaning European whiteness, to America, meaning American whiteness, barely escape America with their lives, and ultimately return to their respective Caribbean islands. If 200 years is all that separates Tituba and Ella, then that means American whiteness has held on to certain types of behavior for a mighty long time, and thus, seemingly disparate narratives are able to be put in context with one another. So first, I turned to Edouard Glissant's The Quarrel with History, published in 1976. And basically what I'm borrowing from him is his idea of capital H history and history with a lowercase h. Capital H history is that of the British Museum, of the Smithsonian, of that of the deep and presumably unimpeachable archive of Western thought and history. Lowercase h history is everything else. Glissant positions Caribbean history in the lowercase h that he names non-history. To quote, because the Caribbean notion of time was fixed in the void of an imposed non-history, the writer must contribute to reconstituting its tormented chronology. That is, to reveal the creative energy of a dialectic reestablished between nature and culture in the Caribbean. Next, I turn to Saidiya Hartman and her ideas of margins of history. Saidiya Hartman in Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America, published in 1997, offers a path to discover non-histories. First, scholars should look at the margins of history. The Western Archive is notorious for deeming certain histories as not worthy of the Western Archive. Second, scholars should brush against the grain of history. To quote Hartman, the effort to brush history against the grain requires excavations at the margins of monumental history in order that the ruins of the dismembered past be retrieved. Turning to forms of knowledge and practice not generally considered legitimate objects of historical inquiry or appropriate or adequate sources for history making, and attending to the cultivated silence, exclusions, relations of violence and domination that engender the official accounts. Glissant says that we have non-histories. There are stories that come from the non-official narrative. Hartman gives us a pathway to discover these things. Last but not least, then, I'm merging the Caribbean with the American. And I'm going towards Christina Sharp. So Sharp articulates that all black people as living in the wake of Euro-American chattel slavery. Thus, wake work concerns itself with plotting, mapping, and collecting the archives of the everyday of Black imminent and imminent death, and tracking the ways we disrupt that imminence and imminence aesthetically and materially. I'm sorry, I forgot to say this. Christina Sharp, In the Wake of Blackness and Being, 2016. Immanence with an A is something that is part of the system. It is baked in. It is a logical conclusion because of the system in place. Imminence with an I is simply something about to happen. For Sharp, then, Black death is a part of the system, and death is something about to happen. The death of Black people is a logical conclusion because Black death is baked into the system. It is as natural as the system itself. A parallel to Black imminence and imminent death is Judith Butler's idea of precarity and vulnerability. Precarity is how close in proximity to danger one is, and vulnerability is how exposed to multiple dangers one is. So that is my theoretical framework. Now I turn to the two novels. First, we start with I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem by Maurice Condé. Novel I, Tituba, while rooted in some degree of historical veracity, is a fictional work. Tituba, the historic person, was the first woman to be accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials. As a fictional character, she suffered violence at the hands of white people in America at almost every scene of her life. She starts describing her mother, Abina, Abina, my mother, was raped by an English sailor on the deck of Christ the King while the ship was sailing from Barbados. Tituba was created for this world by an act of violence on board a vessel that one could only assume by the name sailed the seas spreading the benevolence and love of Jesus Christ. Later, as a child, Tituba witnessed her mother being sexually assaulted and her mother killing the would-be white rapist, and was later hanged. Tituba came to America under the control of Reverend Samuel Parrish, his wife and two daughters. Even though Tituba showed great care for tending to the family, she found herself imprisoned and tried for witchcraft. During the trial, she was imprisoned. Her captors tried to elicit a confession of witchcraft from Tituba. She was beaten and sexually assaulted by these colonial Americans. Let us not forget that she was only in the situation of public scrutiny because a child fell ill and Tituba, the non-being in Salem, was an easy target for social hysteria. Tituba also faced a lynching in which she escaped, but the children of the Jewish man she was enslaved by were all murdered. One of the mob even yelled, "Did we leave England for this?" To quote, did we leave England for this? To see Jews and N-words multiply in our midst? At every step, while in America, Tituba was faced with the omnipresent specter of death at the worst, material violence at the minimum, and she had no recourse. She had to suffer the maltreatment and the indignity of being a non-being to American white people. As Dion Brand called it, the door of no return changes beings into non-beings. To quote, that one door transformed us into bodies emptied of being, bodies emptied of self-interpretation, into which new interpretations could be placed, end quote. Now I turn to Mayal. Mayal addresses a wide variety of topics. The Buildings Roman centers on Ella O'Grady Leary, a mixed-race woman in 1920s Jamaica. The novel unsettles Western orthodoxy in a number of ways, religiously, scientifically, educationally, racially, and socially. The text operates as a counter-narrative, or as the refrain found in the text says, quote, the half that has never been told, end quote. When used as a refrain, the characters in the novel that represent Mayal, the religion, represent and speak into existence the non-histories that run counter to the hegemonic narratives. Colonial education was full of historical inaccuracies that celebrated the British and no one else. Shalini Puri articulates Mayal as a non-history that subverts and disrupts imperial thinking. She says, to quote, "The colony that imitates Europe is a ghost, unable to attain the reality it seeks," end quote. Ella O'Grady Leary was raised in colonial education on the island, and being extremely light complected, she was a perennial outcast among her school peers. As she grew into adulthood, she marries an American, Selwyn Leary, and moves to America. He was occupied with one production, The Making of Ella O'Grady. That's a quote from the text. He wished to recreate her once he realized that in America she could pass as white. He decided to remake her, to civilize her, to let her live as a white American woman. She was clay in his hands. Thus, she told the lies that Leary concocted. In the end, Selwyn Leary decides to use Ella's story to produce his first production, Caribbean Days and Nights. The narrator offers internal exposition of Selwyn. To quote, "He was going to put on the biggest coon show ever," end quote. Selwyn planned to take Ella's stories of Jamaica and commercialize them and sell them as a minstrel show about Caribbean blacks. To quote again, "He was going to travel west with it, and there would be movies, and he was about to be ready to take his place upon the wall beside his father and his grandfather," end quote. One could say that he knew what would sell to his consumer base in 1920s Baltimore, Maryland. During her time with Selwyn, Ella began to fall ill. She was being emptied of her original self, her autonomous self, and replaced with the creation of Selwyn Leary's, as he was, quote, her architect, end quote. Ella becomes ill because her original spirit, the spirit that comes from fragmentation and from the island, was removed and replaced with something foreign, alien, and ultimately evil. This new material took resonance in her body and caused a toxic reaction. The toxicity of her illness could only be cured by Mayal, the religion. Because her education had been steeped in the finest of colonial traditions, Ella didn't realize what was authentically hers to give. She could not understand that Selwyn only wanted to steal her spirit, her story, and her life to gain personal profit. Her body was physically failing, and death was in the air because her spirit had become contaminated. Ella's interaction with American whiteness in the 1920s almost killed her. Only with a return to her place of spiritual purity was she able to excise her ailment. I recognize that the Black Death of wake work refers to a more immediate and physical Black death than the spiritual death through replacement that Ella experiences. However, in this case, I argue that the replacement of one's spirit, one's essence, the thing so internally vital, is in itself a form of death. It is not physical or material, and it doesn't necessarily exist as a social death either. It is almost a subversive death of personal agency, an autonomic death, if you will. Ella's path from child to adulthood showcases the benefits of turning away from Western orthodoxy and, as Puri says, drawing its energies instead from the historically syncretic reality of the Caribbean. So to conclude, Ella O'Grady and Tituba suffered immensely at the hands of white America. Tituba experienced her trauma in the late 1600s. Ella had her run-in with America in the 1920s. That period of time covers a huge swath of American history. To sanitize history of transgression is to fabricate a cultural memory. The first step to changing a cultural memory is to start with the children, as Broadber shows in her critique of colonial education. White America has been anti-black for a very long time. One could argue America has been anti-black longer than it's officially been America. Either way, Condé and Broadber, as Caribbean black women writers, imagine a way forward for the people of the Caribbean as being caught in and having to exist in the wake. While Trump may defund the Department of Education, enact federal policy regarding curriculum, and sanitize the atrocities from American history, One need only to look at the narratives of non-histories. There are stories that exist in the gap. Thank you very much. For questions, here is all of my contact information.